I'd like to introduce Ricardo Esparza, who I just was reminded about is one of the original founding participants of Interface back in 1977. And so he's joined our program committee and has helped us get connected with Brad. So I'm going to turn everything over to Ricardo now to introduce our speaker. So welcome, Ricardo.
Thank you. Marianne Keatley is going to be here today. And right now we're just doing some practical things in terms of waiting for a repairman. So we're going to be a little distracted here. But I think Brad's going to have more than enough to talk about. Just by way of introduction, I think I know some of you. I've been around here in Boulder for a long time. And obviously I've had experience in private practice, but also at the Boulder Mental Health Center through the years. And obviously the issue around money and money management has come up in many different ways. And so when I met Brad, who is my new neighbor within the last year, it's been a fascinating way of looking at some of the issues around money and money management, and especially on how it interfaces with religious values and spirituality, things that often are never addressed in clinical training. So just a couple of things about Brad. Immediately, we both had to deal with some of our issues around money and money management. Within a few months after he was here, he decided to help me out by supposedly shoveling any snow that would come up while Marianne and I went out on vacation. Normally, I would have paid a company to do this, but Brad, being a good neighbor from Hawaii, of all things, decided to pitch in and help me out. And so as a good neighbor, he followed through, because the next day, I don't know if you remember, but I think that we had about, what was it, Brad, about 23 inches of snow. And so the important thing here is that in terms of my value system about money and money management, Brad walked into the breach immediately and took the responsibility of being a good neighbor without having to exchange any money. The other thing about Brad that has been very interesting to me is that as therapists, we all deal with money and money management issues. But a lot of times, once again, no one ever talks to us about our own issues around money and money management. His perspective with his father is very intriguing, because he follows the pathway of, many of you know Murray Bowen family systems therapy. And by looking at your family of origin, you can quickly see that you bring your own issues to the table. Now, what's fascinating in my experience being a therapist, supervising others, training others, is that we're pretty much blind to our own issues. And you can see this generally in mental health, because if you look at malpractice, the main issue that malpractice gets filed against, at least for psychologists, is because of issues around money with clients. So the question does come up, you know, who has the issue, the therapist or the client? And I would like to have you meet Brad today, because he hasn't been here for a very long period of time. And I do think he's a wealth of information, given his psychology training as a clinical psychologist. He also has the experience of having financial training with all the certifications he'll tell you about. And being a good introducer, one of the things that I'd like to do is plug his book. And I do think that the book is well worth it. I don't know, I think it came on your bio, but I really recommend this book as a way of drilling down and looking at some of the issues that you might bring to the table as a therapist, and also at how it might interface with your own religious and spiritual values and those of your clients. With that, I'd like to introduce Brad Klontz to the group.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ricardo. I feel very, very fortunate to be Ricardo's neighbor, and also sort of amazed that he's taken this risk, having never seen me give a presentation. Thank you for your trust in me, Ricardo. Hey, this is my neighbor. He wants to talk to you guys about money. So it is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's essentially my career has been focused on the psychology of money. And it's been a fun career. And it's interesting, in times of crisis, I think that the work that I do and the research I do comes to the forefront. I'll never forget, I do a lot of media interviews, and I'll never forget the one I did. If you've ever done a media interview with somebody who has an agenda, I did a media interview back in 2009, and it was some paper in Florida, and she kept asking questions that were pointing me in a certain direction. And so eventually I just sort of relented, and I said, yes, I'm sure we're selling more books because people are stressed out about money. And the headline read, Merchants of Misfortune. And so that was the headline. That was the only bad media interview I ever had. But I was a merchant of misfortune, which was a terrible sort of feeling for me. And one of the reasons I got really interested in the psychology of money, being a psychologist and in my training, it was said quite explicitly to us in graduate school. And I don't know if you heard a version of this in your training as a therapist, those of you who are therapy, or those of you who are, into clergy members. If you've heard the saying, we're not here to make money, we're here to help people. And this was something that was sort of drilled into us. And if you were interested in making money, then it was somehow unvirtuous, or you were doing something wrong. And then I was always sort of struck with the irony that I then had to borrow $100,000 in student loan debt to get through school. And then I had to go start a business, but I wasn't supposed to care about money. And so I'm going to be sharing with you actually a study I did on therapists and money as we move forward here. So thank you so much for trusting me. And I've had the really good fortune too. I teach at Creighton University. I teach online in their MBA program, where I've developed you can get an MBA with an emphasis in financial psychology and behavioral finance right now. So I spend a lot of time researching this topic, training financial planners and training therapists and psychologists. And I just moved from Hawaii. I was actually really looking forward to meeting you all in person. This is sort of my first experience meeting like-minded healers in Boulder. So I wish we could be doing it non-virtually, but I'm very happy to be meeting with you here and sharing this with you. So in our time together, I want to hit some points. Number one, I want to talk about why we're so crazy when it comes to money. And I feel like calling ourselves crazy around money is actually sort of a healing experience for us, because we're all wired to do it all wrong. And I think it's an important, I call it de-shaming in our work, because we have so much shame when it comes to money. I want to talk to you about my theory of financial psychology and some of the research we've been doing on that. And then diving into that theory, what we've called financial flashpoints, money scripts, and looking at some financial behaviors that we run across in our work with individuals as well as with ourselves. Then I want to talk specifically about the study we did on therapists and money, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A. So as I mentioned, I'm going to try to convince you right from the start that we're all a bit insane, all a bit crazy, all wired to do it wrong when it comes to money. And one of the reasons I like to talk about this is I want people to actually not trust their instincts around money, because we're kind of crazy when it comes to money. And hopefully you're okay with me using that term. We're all in the same boat. I don't know if you remember this commercial. I think it was back in the 80s, where it was, this is your brain and this is your brain on drugs. Does that ring a bell to you? Well, essentially, this is your brain, and then this is your brain on money. It's sort of the same thing. And so, so for example, if I had you right now, and this is actually kind of a fun activity, if you went to your wallet or your purse and you pulled out cash and you actually counted it and touched the cash, studies have shown that within the next 24 hours, you're going to be stronger, you're going to be happier, and more tolerant to pain. So if you remember those old pain tolerance studies where you stick your hand in luckily I never had to participate in one of these. You stick your fist in a bucket of ice water and they time how long you can keep it there. Well, you can actually keep it in there longer if you've been handling money. It just feels incredibly good. And they do controls on this too, right? So if you're counting paper, it doesn't have the same effect. I'll say this too, if I was on stage, and I've done this before in audiences where I take a $100 bill and rip it in half, when they've done MRIs related to that, it's the same areas of your brain that fire off if you're experiencing intense pain. It's really interesting how we're wired around money. This is also really sort of fascinating, because if you talk to a personal financial expert, what they're going to do is they're going to want you to budget, right? They're going to want you to spend some time budgeting. And so the experience of budgeting is something that most people want to avoid, because subconsciously they realize this is going to be a terrible emotional experience. And sure enough, if we had you sit and count up your expenditures and where your money went, over the last week or so, in the next 24 hours, you're going to be more depressed and have more anxiety. And it's just a terrible emotional experience. And so this is, when you go see a financial planner, they're like, okay, step one, track all your expenses. But it's just such a terrible experience for us. It's no wonder we get very little compliance around it. I love this study because it just illustrates just how this makes no sense at all, okay? I mean, it does, because we know about mental health and we understand psychology, but they did a study on Harvard graduate students, and they gave them one of two choices. They said, choice one, you make $100,000 a year, but your friends make $200,000 a year. So that's choice one. Choice two, you make $50,000 a year. So you make half as much, but your friends only make $25,000 a year. So they said, which one of these two choices do you pick? And the majority picked the second choice. So they said, I'd rather make less money, but more than my friends. And I would just suggest to you that in terms of what's in your best financial interest, this is not in line with what's in your best financial interest. I mean, like quite literally, having more money would be in your financial best interests. Fascinating, right? And so one of the ways that I like to look at this is around, we essentially have a hunter-gatherer brain that has evolved over the millennium. And this brain has all of a sudden been thrust into this world of abstraction around money. So we're actually wired to deal, and you know this from the flight response and the work with clients around anxiety. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and the part of your brain that says life or death fires off. And then we, of course, are more prone to do something that we later regret. The prefrontal cortex shuts down when we become really emotionally charged. And so the way I look at our interactions with money is thinking about that hunter-gatherer brain, that tribal brain we all have. Because that part of our brain is wired to consume as much as possible. This is one of the reasons why we struggle with weight and our diets, is because we're programmed to eat sugar and eat fat and eat salt and as much as we possibly can. We're also programmed to just lay around as much as we can. Like, don't exert yourself unnecessarily. Conserve your energy. Same thing with money. We're not wired to save. We're not wired to think in abstract ways around money. And I'm going to talk about how this plays out in our financial life too. But in terms of understanding our relationship with money, I think it really helps to think about this part of our brain. And so going back to those Harvard graduate students, what was more important to them than the money was their status within their tribe. And their tribe, in that example, being their friendship group. They realized on a deep biological subconscious level that it was in their best interest to actually have a more prominent position in that tribe than it was to actually have the money. And man, this explains so many different behaviors. It's an example I have. I lived in Hawaii for 20 years and we just moved here about a year ago. And I think I was in Hawaii for about 5 years when I realized, I just, in the back of my brain, I'm like, I need a truck. I need a pickup truck. And my wife's like, well, why do you need a pickup truck? And I'm like, I just rattled off all these reasons why I needed, more specifically, a Toyota 4-door pickup truck. And so I went and got one. I'm driving it off the lot. And then it hits me as I'm driving away that I look around and everybody is driving a 4-door Toyota pickup truck. And what I realized, and actually they all had the same color I had. And when I was sitting there buying it, I'm like, oh, this looks like a really interesting color. I have no idea why I'm picking this. It's just all these rationales, right? But what was happening for me on a deep subconscious level was I was attuning to what everyone else was doing, and I wanted to fit in with that group. And so it helps explain why people overspend and why we engage in all sorts of self-destructive financial behaviors. And guess what? We had this all figured out. Sigmund Freud, which I found fascinating when I researched this and discovered this, he had actually identified something he called a money complex. And he advocated treating this money complex. Fascinating. A lot of us didn't know this. He said that the strongest symbolic connection between in humanity, in terms of like, all of his dream analysis stuff, is between money and defecation, or gold and feces. So there's already this really negative sort of nasty association with money and gold, and what it means for us as human beings. And I found this incredibly ironic. He was actually quoted as saying that he preferred to suppress rather than explore the impact that was having on his life from his father's financial difficulties. So he identified it as a huge issue for clients, something we should address. But we really haven't done it as a profession. And again, I got some research about why we haven't done it. But in terms of money and mental health, money is the #1 source of stress in the lives of Americans. So the American Psychological Association has a Stress in America survey. They've been doing it every year since 2007. And money's always been #1, except in the year Trump got elected. And then concern over politics actually became #1. But I'm sure it's reverted back to money. So it's traditionally 3 out of 4 Americans say money is the top stressor in their lives. And I would argue to you that in terms of historic perspective, and what's relative, we live in actually a society that's quite abundant. And the quality of life is way better than it ever has been in history for many, many individuals. Yet this is the #1 source of stress in our lives. And I find that incredibly fascinating. That financial strain is associated with a whole host of terrible things. And if you're in practice and you've been in practice seeing people struggle with this, of course, it has an impact on their mood. It has an impact on their health. It actually is a strong mortality risk factor, akin to heart disease and diabetes. And so in the midst of this crisis too, when I do have conversations, I'd like to remind people that the financial situation right now in your life is probably not life-threatening, but be careful because that financial stress can actually kill you. So it's a huge issue in our culture. It's a huge issue for clients, but it's one of the most ignored subjects in the practice, literature, and training in psychotherapy. Huge disconnect there. I sort of joke that when I got interested in the psychology of money, which for me came after I got out of grad school, I owed $100,000 in student loan debt. I saw my friend make $100,000 trading stocks, and I thought, well, of course, this is what I should do. I want to get out of that debt. I grew up lower, below middle class. My mom says we're middle class except lower. And I'm like, Mom, they have words for that. But she didn't want to utter those words. But I was really stressed out about all that debt. I saw my friend make $100,000. And so, I sold everything I had of value. And I bought lawn chairs for furniture. I put all my money in the stock market. I had a fabulous, incredible 3 months. And then the tech bubble burst. And I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm watching all my money melt away. And I'm racked with regret and remorse. And, thank goodness I'm a psychologist, because I knew that it was my mother's fault. And that's my little psychology joke. But what I did is I actually went and I actually interviewed my mother and I interviewed my father. And I found these stories that dated back for generations, which blew my mind. And I'll share some of those with you. But all of a sudden, my behavior made total sense when I saw the family pattern. And that's how I got interested in this. And I sort of joke, through that process, within 2 weeks, I became the world's leading expert in financial psychology, because psychology doesn't want to touch the topic of money. In terms of mental health providers, what we see in studies is we're uncomfortable taking fees from clients. And if you remember the first time you had to do that, as a matter of fact, a lot of us outsource it, right? So we want to either mail them the bills, or we have a secretary or a clerk who does our billing. It feels weird, right? Like you're talking to somebody, you're helping process their trauma, and all of a sudden it's like, ding, okay, that'll be, $300, please. And they write a check, and it's awkward and it feels weird. And so we have unease around that. Our education doesn't include anything related to practice management or business or finance or anything. It's a really ignored topic in most of our graduate programs. And the issue, though, that I think, and the opportunity for us, is to look at our own beliefs around money and look at our countertransference reactions to patients around money and clients around money, because there's a lot of work to be done there for us related to those attitudes and values, so that we can effectively be more a benefit to our clients. So with that, I want to switch into what is financial psychology. And as I'm talking about this, you're going to, in your training, you're going to go, oh yeah, well this just looks kind of like CBT, or this has elements of trauma-focused work. And my answer to all that stuff is yes, absolutely. That's exactly what this is. What's so interesting though is, until we started to do work in this area, there was no research around this. And so essentially that's what we've done is we've taken what we've learned from psychology and just merely applying it to financial planning and personal finance. And so financial psychology, as we've defined it, is the application of clinical psychology to personal finance. So taking all the research we know around cognitive psychology, how we think about money, the mistakes we naturally are wired to make, as well as what it was like for you growing up. And here's a picture of my father. My father passed down beliefs around money to me, and then I'm passing them down to my children. And the issue with money is that it tends to be a taboo topic. And so we don't really talk about it much. So a lot of this is covert versus overt. A lot of it's quite unconscious for us because we're not even aware of our own beliefs around money. I use the example of relationships, and when you're in high school, you start to learn about relationships. You go over to your friend's house, you see how their parents interact. We have a lot of experimentation and a lot of conversations around what kind of mate we want. We do not have the same types of conversations around money. It's a taboo topic. People feel ashamed. Actually, studies show that parents would actually rather talk to their kids about sex than about money. And trust me, I'm not really looking forward to the conversation about sex with my kids. So I have a 7-year-old and I'm just not ready. I probably should be ready. But it's an uncomfortable topic for us. And so the theory that we have around this is we've done research on what we call financial flashpoints, which are these early experiences we have around money. We all have these early experiences. They lead to beliefs around money, which we call money scripts in our research and writing. And then those predict financial behaviors and financial outcomes. So let's start with financial flashpoints. Financial flashpoints are these early life events or series of events we have that are associated with money that are so emotionally powerful, they leave an imprint that lasts into adulthood. Okay, so let me give you some examples of financial flashpoints. Growing up poor. Growing up poor is, I would say, it's like a chronic experience of giving you flashpoints. Seeing people who have, you go school shopping and you're not getting the brand stuff and you're getting the off-brand stuff, and you go into school and a kid makes fun of you for your shoes. Bam, that can be like an emotionally intense experience for somebody that they essentially set the rest of their life course around money to never let that happen again. Those types of experiences. And you know this, working with lower income people, like poverty is just a series of traumatic experiences, very often related to a lack of resources, a lack of safe housing, a lack of food, a lack of clothing. So growing up poor can have a profound impact on somebody's relationship with money. My first book was focused on the financial wisdom of Ebenezer Scrooge, and we use that as an example. Dickens' classic tale from A Christmas Carol. And if you read that book, with this mindset, he grew up in poverty and he was traumatized by it. And so he was so afraid of not having enough that he actually lived a life of poverty while having a lot of money, eating gruel, being cold, not lighting his house. And you see a lot of that with some successful people who were able to acquire money. On the flip side, you see the learned helplessness approach. I don't even want to bother trying, Growing up wealthy can also lead to a whole host of financial flashpoints, believing that, for example, that if you had a painful family system, you might associate that with money. So money's bad. Money separates me from other people. A whole host of experiences. Or you might believe that there'll always be enough money because you never had to worry about it. If you've had a financial rescue experience, so your family's struggling and all of a sudden an aunt or uncle or an inheritance swoops in, takes away all your problems, you might have this expectation that that's how life works. Divorce can lead to a bunch of flashpoint experiences around money when parents are fighting about money. If your dad would only pay his child support, you could get braces, those kind of things. And then I threw board games in here because I had this one client and I was teaching at Kansas State when I had him as a client, and everyone in his family, so he was from Kansas and I met him in Hawaii, but everyone in his family went to Kansas State because they grew up in that area, except for him. Like, he didn't go to college. And super bright guy. I was always kind of curious, like, why didn't you go to college? And so one day I asked him, I said, everyone in your family went to Kansas State. You didn't even go to college. Why? And he's like, I don't know. And I said, well, think about it. And so he started to think about it. Do you guys remember that game called Life? You know, you spin this little thing and you go around the board, and he's sitting here and he goes, oh my gosh, I was probably like 10 years old. I was playing the game of life. And I realized that if you went to college, it kept you out of the workforce for an extra turn. And so I decided to get right into the workforce so that I can make more. And he realized that's the reason he didn't go to college, was because of that board game. Anyway, so these things can be quite unconscious, not in our awareness, but they really do set up our entire relationship with money. The other thing I wanted to mention is trauma. So trauma has an impact in almost every area of our life. It is also, studies have shown, a common underlying cause of what we call money disorders. And so what do I mean by money disorders? Gambling disorder. Up to 82% of the people who struggle with gambling disorder have a history of trauma. Hoarders, significantly more likely. Compulsive hoarding, hoarding disorder. It finally made it into the DSM. I was all excited. Significant history of trauma. I also wanted to mention this: cultural events can lead to trauma. So I did this study on financial planners back in 2008, right in the midst of the financial crisis. And because I was consulting with financial planners at that point, I was trained at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress at the Honolulu VA Medical Center. And so I've always been sort of attuned to trauma and post-traumatic stress. And I'm working with these individuals. I'm like, they have post-traumatic stress. I mean, they're not in the middle of a war zone, but they are experiencing tremendous amount of stress. Many of them are losing their jobs, having to fire people. The people they love most, they're managing their money. They're having to explain to them what's happening. I knew a couple financial planners who got assaulted. Anyway, I did a study, and over 90% of the financial planners in this sample had medium to high levels of post-traumatic stress during that crisis, which led to a bunch of challenging around their thinking. It led to, frankly, some permanent cognitive changes because they want to protect themselves from the next experience. So it has a profound impact on us, financial trauma does. So I want to move on to money scripts now. So we have these early life events. They lead to our beliefs around money. This makes total sense to you as a clinician. And believe it or not, until I did the research, there was only a couple studies done, and it showed there was no relationship between your beliefs around money and your financial outcomes, which I thought was ridiculous. And so I looked at the studies and I'm like, yeah, they weren't great designs. So we've done some research on this, and they do. But before I share the research, I wanted us to just take a couple minutes, and I wanted you to do a little sentence completion. And I'm not going to, make you share this, but it's an experience I want you to have. And what I'd like you to do as you see these little prompts is try to let the first thing that pops into your mind from that deep subconscious place, just go with that and just jot that down, because that's the gold for you, right? Because we all know how to override that by saying, no, I shouldn't feel that way, X, Y, and Z. But just go with that impulse that pops up. That's my invitation to you, even if it's utterly distasteful. But this will give you some insight, sort of shining a light on your subconscious. And I'll just give you, we'll take about 30 seconds for each one of these. So let's go. I guess I'm just throwing them all up at once here. So why don't you go ahead and go through them? So wealthy people got that way by, boom, first thing that pops in your mind. Rich people are, boom. So just go through these sentence prompts and questions and take a moment to jot down your answers. going to give you one more minute. I apologize for the rush. Okay, so I know I probably didn't give you enough time to fully go after this. So I'd encourage you to just jot down those questions or take a picture of them and spend some time with it. So what these sentence stems are designed to do, it's like an incomplete sentence blank, if you've ever used those in your assessments. It's just to sort of draw out some of those automatic thoughts and ways that we approach money. And so if you have some negative thoughts about how wealthy people become wealthy or what rich people are, it's just really interesting to know that, because those come from a real place. Like, all of our experiences and our beliefs come from experiences that are totally real, that happen, and we're trying to make sense of them. The retirement means is a really fascinating one, because if you don't have a really exciting vision of retirement, and as you know too, people who've transitioned into retirement who don't have a really clear vision of that, an exciting vision of that, quite often it becomes a mental health crisis, or at least a challenge for people. And the more concrete you can make that, the more exciting you can make it, the more you're going to be putting energy into wanting to delay gratification, which we're not wired to do. We're wired to actually spend everything that we have. You have to override that natural impulse, and you need a really positive, exciting vision to do that. The question about, is it okay for me to have more than I need when others don't have enough? It's a really critical question. It's a really important thing to have an answer to. And if you don't have a really solid answer that feels really good for you, of course, you're going to be vulnerable to not taking care of yourself, not setting money aside to take care of yourself. And then, of course, what did your mom teach you about money? What did your dad teach you about money? So essentially what these sentence stems are doing, and we have other ways to assess this that I'll be sharing with you, is trying to get at these money scripts. So money scripts are typically subconscious beliefs we have about money. Quite often they're multi-generational. And so one of the things that I discovered in my family after I lost all my money in the tech bubble, and I went home, and in my interview with my mother, and my poor mother, I put her through this before, where you sit there with a tape recorder and you interview your parents for grad school. My poor mother, she's like, oh boy, here we go again. And I started to ask her questions about money. What was it like for you growing up around money? What was it like for grandma and grandpa? And I got to tell you, I was floored. I had never heard these experiences. And all of a sudden, my entire family made sense. So my grandfather on my mother's side and grandmother, they were poor. So they lived actually in the Detroit ghetto. And we eventually got them out of the ghetto into a trailer park. It was a safe trailer park area, but they didn't have much money. And what I didn't know is that my grandfather, who's a generous and giving person, but what happened to him was during the Great Depression, as a young man, he went to the bank and all his money was gone. So he went to the bank, and I just can't even imagine that experience. So all the money he had saved, whatever that was, gone. And not only that, he couldn't even talk to anybody. The bank was locked. And so what belief would you have based on that flashpoint? Well, he had the belief you can't trust banks with your money. I mean, this is a very logical belief that comes from that experience. And he had a really strong belief related to that. So he had a lot of emotional intensity related to that belief. Okay, but what I didn't know is he never put $1 in the bank the rest of his life. So he lived into his 90s, never put $1 in the bank for the rest of his life. He kept it in a lockbox in his attic or under the bed. And people kept breaking into the house all the time in Detroit. And of course, they figured out this is what he was doing. But yeah, that's what he did. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And so now my mother's extremely anxious approach to money, not investing anything, You know, she would only put money in CDs, but only up to that federal limit, or in a savings account. So all of a sudden, her anxiety about not having enough made total sense to me. And then what did I do? I came along and I'm like, well, I don't want to live poor like my family. I want to do what rich people do. Oh, they invest. Here's my friend, he made $100,000. So I call it the dysfunctional pendulum swing. You may have a word for it. You see it when someone has a real intense relationship with something, that their offspring or their kids will very often mimic it or do the exact opposite to an extreme. That's what I did. Super conservative, like dangerously conservative family, like harmfully conservative. And I went to the radical, to like the most risk-taking thing you could possibly do. All in one asset class, at a bubble, etc. So seeing those multi-generational patterns are just unbelievable, because it really helped me feel better, frankly, better about myself. You know, there's nothing like a little blame for your ancestors to make you feel a little bit better about why, of course you're doing what you're doing. Of course you did. You were raised in that environment. You don't know any better. So they are multi-generational. They're also very often developed in childhood, where just like that client of mine playing the board game, an adult would have looked at that very differently. It would have looked at, well, this is just a board game. These rules were constructed by somebody. This isn't real life. The childlike brain goes, oh, this must be what life is like, because you have a limited range of experiences. So most of these beliefs are developed in childhood. They're subconscious in the sense that we don't really talk about it. We don't have a lot of opportunities to examine these beliefs, to argue with our friends about them or have debates, because we don't talk about money. They're always based on truth, which I think is really, really important. These beliefs are based and anchored on truth. You can't trust banks, 100% true. Now, the problem is the context change. And flexibility in thinking is a part of mental health, right? We need to be able to adapt to changing circumstances, but they're always based on a partial truth. They tend to be resistant to change, especially when there's intense emotion attached to them, like when they're traumatic. And they're also culturally bound. So, and I mean culture in a lot of different ways. I mean, based on political party have different beliefs around money. Religious affiliations have different beliefs around money. Ethnicity has different approaches and beliefs around money. Very, very different across ethnicities. And so we inherit these. They come down to us. They're sort of baked in. And what we have found in our research is they drive all of our financial behaviors. And so I've personally done maybe a dozen studies on this, and there are more and more studies being done on this all the time. They predict things. I'll show you what they predict, essentially. So one of the things I had to do, I never wanted to be a test designer, but essentially, as I mentioned, nobody had done any research in this area. So I had to develop tests related to this because I wanted to see if our interventions were effective. And so one of the tests we ended up developed, we called the Klontz Money Script Inventory. And we identified, essentially what we did is we gathered money beliefs from clients. We used to run a workshop related to money disorders for about 10 years. And we've had hundreds and hundreds of people go through it. And as part of the exercises, we did stuff like I just did with you with those incomplete sentence blanks. We gathered as many of these money beliefs as we possibly could. We pared them down, looked for patterns, and then we put that out into some studies and did some factor analysis and all that. But at the end of the day, we found 4 different categories of money scripts. And I'm going to share those with you right now. And as I'm sharing this, think about your clients, think about yourself. The first category we found, we named money avoidance. Now, these are beliefs like rich people are greedy, money corrupts, people get rich by taking advantage of others. There's virtue in living with less money. There's actually virtue. You're more virtuous if you have less money. Good people shouldn't care about money. So we named this money avoidance for obvious reasons. So it's sort of a combination of there's virtue in not having money and rich people are bad. Now, probably not a big surprise, but this is associated with having lower income, lower net worth, being younger, single, and less educated. And so this is a pattern you're going to see with all these self-destructive beliefs. People have a tendency to be younger, single, and less educated when they endorse them. So it's almost like as we get older, we get a more balanced perspective. I think the single thing is really interesting because when you're in a partnership with somebody, you can't sort of hide in your subconscious around money. It actually comes out, and then your partner's going, hey, look at that. I don't think that's the way it works. And I think it's an opportunity for us to challenge some of those beliefs. And it's also predictive of money disorders. So, and by that, I mean self-destructive financial behaviors. So the first category, money avoidance. Here's a little hint. Therapists are more likely to have this one than non-therapists. Okay, The second category we found, money worship. These are individuals who believe that money is power, more money will make me happier, money buys freedom, and things in my life would be better if I had more money. And I think this sort of represents the average American, if you don't mind me saying. This belief that money is going to magically change my life and make me happier, which, by the way, it does up to about middle class. So there's definitely a correlation. And if you lived in poverty yourself or grew up poor, or if you work with poor people, obviously, having more money is going to make your life better. But it sort of ceilings out at that median level of income in the United States. And that number changes. There's been several studies, but it's always around the median. And it goes back to that Harvard grad student study. It's like, where do I compare to everybody else? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, do I have shelter? Do I have food? Do I have clothing? Can I take care of my basic needs? Above that, $75,000 a year is the latest study. No correlation between money and happiness. So you're making 75,000 versus 75 million. There's no significant difference there in terms of happiness, which, by the way, nobody ever believes me. I don't even believe me when I say that. But that's what the research shows. And money worship is associated with lower income, lower net worth, being younger, single, and less educated, and self-destructive financial behaviors. Now, I'll share this too, because I think this is just utterly fascinating. So people who are more money avoidant, so score higher on money avoidance, also score higher on money worship. And it's a very significant correlation. I think it's like 0.45, which is just unbelievably significant. So essentially, this is the psychology. Money's bad, rich people are evil, but I desperately want money and I want to be rich. And isn't that an interesting dichotomy, and just going around with that rattling around in your subconscious, right? And so I work with people like this, and what happens is they start to acquire money because they're driven for it, and then they look at their bank account and then they feel guilty, then they get rid of it, and it's just this whole seesaw thing because they haven't really resolved this and really haven't really grasped it. And you see it in couples too who share this. Anyway, higher credit card debt is also associated with this. So if money's going to make me happier, then of course things are going to make me happier. The third category is what we call money status beliefs. This is another destructive mindset around money. This is where you're really linking your self-worth with your net worth. So my self-worth equals my net worth. I'm not going to buy something unless it's new. If someone asked me, another one is, someone asked me how much money I made, I'd tell them I make more than I actually do. And if something isn't the best, it's not worth buying. So these are individuals, they're sort of the keeping up with the Joneses. By the way, that's a real thing. I think I probably should have called it that, but it's a real thing. It's associated with lower income, lower net worth, being younger, single, and less educated, higher credit card debt, and this is the only one that we found that was associated with the socioeconomic class you grew up in. And so those outward displays of status are really, really fascinating. We've done some studies on, I didn't prepare it for this, but we've done some studies on wealth, the psychology of wealth. And what we have found is that there is a psychology associated with ultra high net worth compared to middle class. And that's one of the studies we did. And there's a lot of variables in there, like locus of control is one. So that internal locus of control, super, super helpful, and frankly, in every aspect of your life, but also in terms of money and in terms of wealth. The other thing that we found, which I found was fascinating, is that we have this false narrative around what we think rich people do. And by the way, the word rich, I talk about that sometimes because what does the word rich mean? It means somebody who has more money than you, essentially. There is no like actual definition. And people usually have some stank on it, is what I say. You know, there's usually some judgment associated with the word rich. And I work with a lot of ultra wealthy people, none of whom consider themselves rich. It's like they're always comparing themselves to someone else. So I think it's just sort of a fascinating concept. But what we found is that the ultra wealthy in our sample had 18 times more money than the middle class, which is a lot more money. So they had like about 12 million in net worth compared to 500,000. But, and this is the fascinating part, they only spent about twice as much on their house, their car, their watch, and their vacation. And I would just suggest to you that the popular culture does not believe that at all. What they see are, they don't see people sacrificing, saving, working hard to acquire net worth. What they see are outward displays of wealth, which is actually not the norm for most self-made, if you want to call them that, people who didn't grow up wealthy, who are wealthy now, think about it. The discipline requires you to actually save and not spend. That's the only actual way to grow your net worth. And so anyway, I do think it's fascinating, something I talk about all the time, and I try to educate younger generations on, because we don't believe that to be true. We think that they have mansions and they have all this. That's just not most of them by a long shot. The fourth category is what we call money vigilance. And this is the category that is associated with actually good financial outcomes. Beliefs like money should be saved, not spent. It's important to save for a rainy day. I'd be a nervous wreck if I didn't have enough money saved for emergencies. Another one is that they actually downplay how much money they had. So if you ask, one of the questions was, if someone asked me how much money I made, I'd probably tell them I make less than I actually do. That's the opposite of the money status, which actually have less money. This is associated with higher income, higher net worth, lower credit card debt, and better financial health overall. So those are the four categories we found, which I think it's a quick and easy way to assess. And so if you're interested in that, I'll give you a link to a test here, the one that we used in all of our research studies. You could just take it if you wanted to see which category you pop up in. But our money scripts, so our financial behaviors make perfect sense when we understand what those money scripts are. Like all of those financial behaviors based on that belief, it makes perfect sense. These are very logical conclusions to those beliefs. And those money scripts make perfect sense if you know the financial flashpoints and the experience somebody had growing up. So the test is the Klontz Money Script Inventory. I figure if you're going to give a test away for free, you should name it after yourself. That was the logic. yourmentalwealthadvisors.com. That's where that test is. That's my asset management site. You can take it there. You'll get the email results. So check it out if you're interested. So we've got those early experiences. They lead to beliefs around money. And then these lead and predict your financial behaviors. So there's one category of financial behaviors I want to talk about that we have called money disorders in our research. So these are those financial behaviors that go beyond just like mismanagement of money, but they lead to the clinically significant distress, impairments in your life. And there are some of those. And what's been great for me is seeing some of those make their way into the DSM. So one that hasn't made its way there yet, but should be soon, is compulsive buying disorder. Compulsive buying disorder, actually, I think the prevalence rates are just as high as depression in the United States. So the same number of people who have depression, suffering from a major depressive disorder right now, are suffering from compulsive buying disorder, which to me is just an incredibly large number. And most people haven't really heard about this, but essentially it's what it sounds like. It's an addiction to shopping is how it usually plays out, where people get an endorphin rush, they engage in a behavior, they crash, they feel ashamed. This actual pattern is responsible, I think, for most returns to stores. And it's a very devastating disorder, compulsive buying disorder. You can actually bill for it on the DSM under impulse control disorder. Gambling disorder is another one, hoarding disorder. Workaholism is another one that we identify. Possibly you could diagnose it as a personality disorder, OCPD. But it's an interesting one because you have workaholics who love their jobs and workaholics who hate their jobs. It manifests itself very differently. You also get paid more when you're workaholics, so that you get some reinforcement for it, but it has devastating effects. So there's research done on this. Your relationships are worse, your kids resent you, your health is worse. I'm probably talking to a bunch of workaholics right now. So watch out for that. And then of course there's depression and anxiety that are associated with your financial strain and stress. So those are the disorders, but the average American is a financial mess. We're overspenders, undersavers. There's a couple other of these disorders or conditions, I would say, problematic financial behaviors that I think I'll call out for you. One is called financial dependence. And we've done some studies on that, and I haven't really seen any other studies done on it. But I saw it at the VA when people were getting paid related to the disability, which it was very appropriate. However, I saw it have some devastating psychological consequences. In my family, I've got a lot of family members who've been part of the welfare system, are still part of the welfare system. There's a whole mindset that comes with that dependence on that check from the government. I also work with a lot of ultra wealthy families who have a trust fund, and there's some dependence related to that trust fund. And what's interesting about the psychology is they're very, very comparable. So whether it's multi-generational welfare mindset, multi-generational trust fund mindset, financial dependence has a devastating effect. So the studies that we've done, it leads to less creativity, less passion, less purpose-driven experiences in your life, and interestingly, resentment towards the source of the money. And so it's something to guard yourself against just either side of the spectrum. And actually, it's also a leading reason why women will return to abusive relationships is because of that financial dependence. Financial enabling is the flip side. We've all worked with enablers, quite often around substance abuse, but it's financial help that hurts. It hurts quite often the person giving the help, and it hurts the recipient of the help who might be financially dependent. Financial denial is another interesting one. I'm not sure if you've heard of financial infidelity before, but it's exactly what it sounds like. And we've done some studies on that too. But it's lying or deceiving your partner or spouse around money. And what's interesting about it is 1 out of 3 Americans report doing this. It's the same number of Americans, 1 out of 3 report lying to themselves about money too, which it might be the exact same people who say, I'd rather not think about money. I try to push it aside. I don't want to talk about it. So these are pretty common in our culture. And what I would argue to you and suggest to you is that if you're in the mental health field, this is something you can address. Like, you don't need to be an expert in money to address this, because the 2 biggest problems people have around money is spending more than they make and not saving for the future. And I've yet to meet an individual who doesn't know better, right? So it's not like it's this wealth of financial knowledge you need to be dropping on people. They already know what they should be doing. And so I think the bulk of the work is psychological around, what's happening here? Where did these beliefs come from? And intervening at that level. So that's my suggestion to you. So I'm going to talk about this just because I think you'll find it interesting, and I think it'll help make sense on some of what I'm talking about. We just did a study that came out last fall where we took financial psychology. The exciting thing for me around this was we did a double-blind randomized control trial, which has just always been my dream to do one of those. And it was, luckily I had some research funding for it. But what we did is we put people in 2 rooms, and we did it in 5 cities across the country, in hotels, conference rooms. We put half the people in a financial education seminar, the goal to get people to save more money. The other half, we did financial psychology on them. And this is what we found. Excuse me. So we looked at those 2 things. We compared education versus the psychology approach. We did it in these cities. And what we saw in the financial psychology group is a 73% increase in savings after 1 hour. So people saved about 10%. They jumped up to 17%. Financial education, there was a 22% increase. They went from 10% to 12%. Okay, so what did we do in there? Essentially, I've got it up there. You can't see it, but essentially, we did a few things. I educated people on money scripts, just the way I just educated you. And then what we did is we tried to activate that animal brain, that tribal brain, that prehistoric brain to get it super excited about a goal. And so we did it in a couple different ways, but essentially what we did is we had people get really specific about their goals. We had them create vision boards, for lack of a better word. Really, really specific around what it is they want. Words like retirement, way too abstract. Words like saving account, way too abstract. And so we used some various techniques, like it's not a savings account, it's a family European vacation 2022 account. It's not just an educational account, it's like Ethan's college fund. So we had people name it, we had them put a date on it, we had them automate. So we got them super excited about it, and then we had them automate movements from checking to savings accounts or retirement accounts. We just suggested that they do this. Just ways to make it more concrete, more exciting. And it really tipped people over the edge, really massive increases there. People essentially off the street in that study. We did a similar thing. We did it with Mutual of Omaha. We took their 401k sign-up meeting, we threw it out the window, and we gave them little stickers and had them create their ideal little retirement book. We did it with some truck drivers. By the way, the truck drivers came in, they're all burly, guys with tattoos were like, no, 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 cut it out, because we gave people stuffed animals and stickers. We thought they were going to kill us. But what we saw is a dramatic increase in savings for their retirement plans. They went from about 4% to almost 6%. And 70% of them wanted a meeting with a financial advisor at the end because they got so excited about what they wanted to do for retirement. So I bring up these two studies because I think there's so much that can be done to improve the financial lives of Americans by just give them a little bit of dose of therapy, a little bit of dose of what we know from psychology. It's just total fertile ground to have a massive impact on society. I want to share this with you. First of all, don't buy this book. I'm not trying to sell you this book at all, but I just wanted to let you know some of what we've been doing and what's already out there. So this is a textbook that's being used in a lot of universities. It's called Financial Therapy. But essentially what we've done here is we've taken schools of psychology and schools of therapy and applied it to financial work with people. It's cognitive behavioral, solution-focused, feminist, humanistic, acceptance and commitment, psychodynamic, systemic, motivational interviewing. So there's a body of work that's being done. I'm just letting you know this to find ways to take what we've already been doing in the realm of mental health and applying it to people's relationship with money. So I want to get on to therapists and money because I know that some of us are therapists, at least I think most of us, I would say, probably are healers or are interested in healing. So this is based on a study that we did a few years back. I called it the Financial Health of Mental Health Professionals. We had a sample of about 264 people. These are just the demographics. Most of them grew up in middle class. Most of them were making, the average income was about $100,000. We used a bunch of predictor variables, financial health, money scripts, which I just talked to you about, life satisfaction, normal demographics you would do in a study, their financial status, their SCS in childhood, et cetera. And so that's just the general idea of the study. And then I want to share with you the results of mental health professionals. So in terms of global financial health, and so this is essentially, are you saving for the future? Do you have insurance? Are you saving for retirement? Do you have credit card debt? Basic financial health type information. What we saw is that mental health professionals had significantly less financial health compared to, essentially what I did for this is I gathered data from therapists in general, but I used a couple of the state psychology associations, and then I compared them to, I didn't really compare them to, but we did statistically, but then the other group I sampled from was like a chamber of commerce in a couple different areas. So what we found here is comparing those two groups essentially is Asian Americans reported better financial health overall. we had a decent sized Asian American sample because some of the sampling was done in Hawaii. And life satisfaction was positively associated with financial health. So, and as I said, therapists had lower financial health than the other groups. In terms of disordered money behaviors, so these are those sort of self-destructive financial behaviors, not just your financial status, but what are your actual behaviors? Mental health professionals had higher self-destructive financial behaviors. And these money disorders, as I mentioned too, that money status belief isn't good for you. And money disorders were, anyway, so the key point on this slide is money disorders are really bad for you, and therapists were more likely to have them. In terms of risk planning was another predictor variable, positively associated with that money vigilance. So this is taking care of yourself on the risk side. Like, do you have adequate insurance? It's a really good idea to have risk planning. And this is one of the areas that mental health professionals weren't so good at in terms of hedging their risks. And then I threw in the self-care part because I'm like, please, just, we're at least better at taking care of ourselves, right? No. So we weren't better at taking care of ourselves, even non-financially. And self-care is actually a good thing. It's actually associated with higher net worth and higher life satisfaction. So in essence, to sum up this research on mental health providers, and the study was really done because I was trying to just sort of validate or just explore whether my experience in grad school was indicative of a profession, of our approach to how we look at money as a profession, Or was it just a one-off experience I had at my particular grad school experiences? And so, but what we found is evidence. And again, this is the only study that's ever been done on this, so please replicate it. But mental health providers are more likely to hold money avoidant beliefs. Things like money is bad, rich people are greedy, there's virtue in living with less money. We are also more likely to engage in financial denial behaviors. So not wanting to think about our money, not wanting to look at our bank statements, trying to forget about our financial situation. So we're not really taking care of ourselves well around money. We're also more likely to have lower financial health as a result, and also more likely to report higher self-destructive financial behaviors. So anyway, part of what I'm trying to do here is just sort of encourage us to embrace the idea that is it okay for us to be taking care of ourselves? I think it is. I don't think that if you, for example, save 20% of your income, I don't think that makes you a bad person at all. As a matter of fact, I think that might even make you more effective in your work with clients. If we have negative and just really sort of checking on the countertransference. And I've actually heard this, and not to pick on anybody, but I've heard this come out of therapists' mouths where, essentially, like, what does that person have to complain about? They're ultra wealthy, right? The worried well, like our judgments towards people who might have more. I think as a profession, we're pretty good at not judging people who have less quite as harshly, in all honesty. But do we have this natural sort of bias against people who have more, as if it's somehow bad? And how much of that relates to looking on that money worship side? Do we sort of put money on a pedestal subconsciously and wish we had more? And are we transferring that over on clients? So these are all just questions I think that it helps us to ask as a profession. The other thing that I've written about quite extensively in mental health and in psychology is I feel like we are in an incredible position to help people around their biggest source of stress in their lives. Like, who are they going to go talk to about their money stress, which is the biggest source of stress in their lives, if we are uncomfortable talking about it? And so one of the things that I suggest is in your assessment with clients, are you asking them about their financial stress? Are you asking them about their financial status? Is this, because I know that in my training that never even came up. I'm supposed to ask about their military status. I'm supposed to ask about what it was like for them growing up. I'm supposed to ask about their substance use status, but never was I supposed to ask about their financial status and how they feel about it and how much stress they have. How much credit card debt are they carrying? What keeps them up at night? What do they worry about related to money? I was never trained to ask anyone any of those questions, which I think is tragic and ironic, since that's the actual number one thing that they're actually stressed about. So who are they supposed to talk to, if not us? We're in a position there. And what I found and what I've noticed, so I've been doing this work since about 2001 as a specialty. And what I noticed is during 2008, 2009, therapists became much more open to talking about this. I think partially because we were dealing with it ourselves, as well as just about every client coming in was concerned about it. And I think we're experiencing a cultural event right now where we're having that same sort of experience. So anyway, I think that part's good, as a profession, that we can bring money into the conversation. But I think a lot of it starts with who we are around money and what is our relationship with money. So in conclusion, I guess I just sort of went through this, but money is the number one source of stress in the lives of our clients. So I think we should assess for it. I think it's something we should think about. Psychologists and therapists are at risk for having negative beliefs about money and about wealth and lower levels of financial health. Psychological factors are associated with financial health and powerfully associated. And so this is another call to action for our own lives and in the lives with our clients and those we work with. You don't need to be an expert in personal finance. As an example, people are not stressed and suffering because they don't know the difference between a Roth IRA and a traditional IRA. That's not the level of suffering. You do not need to be an expert in what people invest in, for example, to bring up this topic. You don't need to be an expert in budgeting. People are actually struggling on a really, really sort of fundamental level around not saving and spending more than they make. Those are the primary areas of struggle. And I know there's a lot that we need to do, I think, culturally to support people. And I think it's an incredible thing to look at that. Like, for example, healthcare costs, universal healthcare, all that sort of thing. And so my focus though is the person in my office and trying to help them better their lives. And so I've just seen so much that people can do on that personal level of empowerment if they have the right mindset, if they have the beliefs around money that are associated with people being able to climb that socioeconomic ladder. And that's sort of the one of my missions in life, is to help people who grew up the way I grew up understand the mindsets of how people become wealthier and engage quite simply in those beliefs and behaviors. So for example, I'm active on social media. If you've ever heard of TikTok, I do a lot of TikTok videos. And one of the things I put out there, I want to challenge this mindset that, if you grew up poor, that you don't have access, that learned helplessness, if you will. And so one of the videos that I have, I actually show it very simply, that if somebody saved $5 a day for 42 years and had put it in the S&P 500, which is just sort of this, index fund, you just stick money in there and you don't worry about it. In 42 years, it's $1 million. So this is something that I'm actually trying to educate lower income, middle-class kids who are 18, 19, like that's how, if you want to become a millionaire, that's how you do it. I mean, you don't need special access. And one of the things we found in our studies too, I loaded every stereotype of ultra wealthy people I could in the study. Frankly, because I wanted to see what was true. I had no idea. I actually don't really care how the results go. But in the study we did, it was over 1,000 wealthier people. 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 went to public school. Most of them worked. Most of them were first generation in the sense that they didn't grow up at that ultra high net worth level. A very small percentage, like 3%, had chefs and chauffeurs. I asked everything. I wanted to know about all these stereotypes. Another interesting one was they weren't any more tax avoidant. I actually looked for a tax avoidance scale, and of course none existed. But I've always heard growing up, rich people don't want to pay taxes. Like, this is just sort of this thing that I've learned. But I didn't know if it was true, so I just threw that in there. And it turns out that nobody wants to pay taxes, actually. There was no significant difference between the middle class and the ultra wealthy. Nobody's super excited about paying taxes. I also heard that, and this is kind of sad, but I also heard that, rich people are more reclusive, right? They more keep away from people. But there was the same number. I had to come up with I forgot what I called it. It's sort of like closeness with neighbors scale. All these ridiculous things I had to create because nobody had done it. But essentially, nobody really talks to their neighbors much anymore. So there was no significant difference there. But I thought that was kind of sad. Actually, one of the benefits of this pandemic is I really, really know my neighbors well. Ricardo and Marianne, we've been getting together more in the alley and sharing meals. So that's been a positive benefit there. So I think it's sort of challenging some of those stereotypes around wealth, because I grew up with those stereotypes. And I just find it so fascinating that they're just not panning out in the research. And I think it's just at least a barrier that we can look at within ourselves. And of course, with the confirmation bias, you can Google right now and find all these terrible examples of rich people doing terrible, terrible things, right? But there's also examples of people who have incredible amounts of wealth who are doing incredibly great things in the world. I'll give one example of Warren Buffett, who is, I think he's worth about $80 billion. He's one of the most successful investors of all time. He's giving 99% of his wealth away to charity, most of it to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so I use that as an example when I'm helping challenge the beliefs that people have around ultra wealthy people. So in summary, money beliefs predict our behaviors and outcomes. I feel like as for our own lives and our work with other people, challenging those beliefs, understanding those beliefs, there's so much benefit that can be done experimenting with that and looking at that. And since as mental health professionals and psychologists, we are experts in challenging and changing those beliefs and behaviors. And so I feel like it's sort of a call to action, if you can, within your own life or in the work with clients, to just embrace that and jump in there. And so with that, Barry, I want to thank you so much for having me here. And thank you, Ricardo. And I'm happy to answer any questions or participate in any discussion from here.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was fantastic. People, questions, comments? One thing I was mulling over in growing up as a baby boomer is money was not emphasized because politically, culturally, everything that came before us wasn't working. And there was kind of this idea or belief that it wasn't proper or correct to think about making a living. It was more about changing the world or doing what you like and the money will follow. There was these catchy little things that diverted us away from making a living or being driven by the goals that our parents who came through the Depression so much emphasized. We didn't trust anybody over 30, so why would we listen to anybody saying you have to get a degree so you can make more money? That was so antithetical to what we saw around us. So now we have many baby boomers who are living in trailers or poor and don't have any retirement funds. And there's some people that have inherited a great deal of wealth. I don't know that there's any cultural generation trend. I wonder if you have an opinion about that. Are there sort of a generational trends about money, cross-generational trends?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I've observed related to that. So absolutely on the cultural side, generational side. So if you knew anyone from the Great Depression, I mean, an entire generation of anxious money hoarders, right? Of stuff, like there's not going to be enough. I sort of joke that your crazy uncle with the stockpile of supplies probably didn't look too crazy in March, right? When we were running out of things. But it's just sort of this natural thing that happens. And then what we've seen is millennials who saw their parents lose their houses in 2009, have to go back to work. That entire generation is less trustful of the stock market and investing, which is fascinating. So there's definitely these cultural things. The other thing I wanted to mention is we have actually, this has sort of happened subtly without an announcement. Nobody got the memo. The schools aren't picking up the slack. But my grandfather's generation, the promise was this: you have a pension. The pension's going to take care of you. Social Security is going to fill in the gap. So how much do you need to save for retirement? Zero. It's all taken care of for you. And what's happened very subtly behind the scenes is we've moved from pensions, defined benefits, to defined contribution. Now there's one name change there, totally different scenario. So now essentially it's 100% on you as an individual if you want to be able to retire and take care of yourself. So huge cultural shift there. And we're way behind. Like, people haven't gotten the memo. We're not training kids in this. And so anyway, that's the other thing that I think is huge cultural shift that has put a lot of people at risk.
To follow up, the generation that's coming up, the Pikes now have no security in the environment or ever being able to purchase a house. It came out, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago in the Times that there's more adult children moving back to live with their parents than ever before in history in the United States. So that there's now a generation of insecurity across the board, I think, that overlaps with the money issue. Kathy, you have to unmute yourself. I just unmuted you.
Okay. I recently read a book that was very uplifting in terms of money. It's called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. And she points out quite convincingly that we are a rich country and can absolutely afford to fund any program we value, so long as it doesn't cause inflation, which is almost impossible to cause when you have unemployment to the level that we have, or even anywhere close to that level. And so she points out that we could easily and without any negative consequence fund safe retirement for people in this country. And now that doesn't mean we're going to, because we've been raised and brainwashed to think that that we shouldn't, that we should be totally efficient, and that we should budget, our country should budget like a household, that they must tax in order to spend. That used to be true back when we had the gold standard and all that, but we haven't had that for quite some time. And it's actually no longer true. It's a really interesting book. And you know, all we'd have to do is like change some of the laws, like put Social Security on the same, Social Security on the same footing as Medicare B and SSDI, and we just have to commit to it, and it's done, and we don't need to worry about it. But that involves changing a law that was made to make Social Security more palatable to people, it's supposed to come from a certain trust fund. Well, that does not need to be how it's done. Anyhow, I thought that was very interesting and might change or might even revolutionize our approach to money.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting. I'm going to check that book out.
Check it out. It's really good. And she reads it herself on Audible. I bought the physical book and I also listened to it while I was taking walks.
I appreciate your point, Brad, about how we don't include in our interviews, intake or otherwise, about people's values about money or where they are, whether they know where they stand financially. I think in the denial is a good protective mechanism to avoid the stress, the fight, flight, freeze. There are a lot of freezers, people who are just not willing to look at stuff that's troubling or potentially threatening. I wonder if any of us here, I see on our pictures, many of us are therapists or on the line right now. Do you have any comments about that from your clients? Is it something you've thought of incorporating or have done, or any observations from your practices?
Hi, Barry, it's Lori. So what I have on my intake form is just, it's kind of a whole list of possible issues. And one of them is financial concerns. And the way I work with my intake form is I then meet with the person after I look at the intake form in more detail. So it's usually the second session. And then I'll talk to them specifically about that, about, if they had marked, I have like a 0 to 10 rating on that. And then if they had marked, I would say over 3, I'll ask them more about it so that I can support them. The other thing that I'd like to say just personally is, I would call myself a pauper when I was in my 20s and, kind of getting into the therapy field, really making very little. I called it a quasi-volunteer job, really. And I found myself in the room of Debtors Anonymous, and I have recommended this 12-step program to so many people over the years. Not just for credit card debt, which I really wasn't a credit card debt person. I think my parents did some good things about that for me, but I certainly was I would classify myself as a under earner, and then kind of chained to work addiction because I had to run like 3 or 4 different jobs so that I could just make, support myself. That being said, at 23, I bought a condo in Boulder, which, I think the DA program really helped me to pull it together, to really pull my finances together and to see it more as, like we did a spending plan versus a budget. Maybe it likens to like somebody who's an overeater who would have an eating plan versus being on a diet. There was something about the wording and the scarcity piece. So, just thought I would share that. It's a really great program. I'm no longer in it, but it was certainly helpful for me to lay some foundation to get out of the vagueness about where I was spending money and to become accountable to myself. So, anyway, so thank you for the presentation. I thought it was very well done and gave me a lot of things to where I can help clients in the future and direct them towards you and your resources. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing up Debtors Anonymous. I believe there's also an Under Earners Anonymous, which is, a fabulous program from what I've heard and the clients that I've worked with.
Yeah. I've been out of that loop for a while. So, but it's a great idea, because I do think that that's, you know, certainly, you know, with the psychology of it, I think it makes sense to me that some people, you know, as you were talking about the 4 types and the whole thing about money being money avoidant. I certainly was there at one point, like, and another gift I had at some point when I started private practices, being with my accountant, who asked me why I was, you know, why I had a business. And I said, to make money. And she said, I said to help people. And she said, no, to make money. That's why you have a business, to make money. So that was really, you know, it was really good for me to hear that explicit, not only message, but kind of permission. Like, this is why people have a business, Lori, is to make money, you know, come on. So that it was very helpful.
You know, those of us who've had some experience in community mental health is where people who don't have money wind up because they can't afford private practice. And so the stories about people and money may be swayed or different from people in private practice versus in public or community health center. And thinking about Richard, who just joined us, and King, in the arena of spirituality and church, I wonder if people turn to churches when the government is not there. Do people turn to food banks when they have no food? Where do people turn when they can't afford things? So I think the churches or community spiritual organizations pick up the slack that our government or our society drops the ball with. So I wonder, King, do you have a comment about that, or Richard?
Well, I'm more of a visitor at this than I am a participant, but there are a number of issues that he brought up that I have thoughts on. But specifically to the question of, do people turn to churches? Yes, they turn to churches for all kinds of issues, whether it is their food insecurities or whether it is their inability to pay their rent. They turn to churches, at least the church that I used to pastor. But Brett brought up the issue of what I used to call relative deprivation. That's not what he called it, but people feel better when they're in the herd. If they're in the herd, they feel better. It doesn't make any difference so long as they are slightly above the herd or in the herd. That makes them feel better.
Comment?
As a pastor, I used to do all the way through my marriage counseling. My marriage counseling was a fairly long session, but one of the things I talked about, in addition to your health, was money. And I spent a lot of time talking about their individual beliefs about money, because what you believe about money can cause you to break up quicker than almost anything else. So much of what Brad said, I remembered back to when I was doing counseling. Brad, have you ever spent any time around, well, you have, but the issue of the Harvard study is really an issue of, in my opinion, an issue of relative deprivation. I much rather be in the herd than be deprived or around, even if I make less money.
Yeah, absolutely. So relative deprivation, there's been some really incredible studies on it, and it's a brilliant point, and I'm glad you brought it up. So essentially, like, your objective financial status, that's not what determines how you view your life satisfaction. It's your comparison group, who you're comparing yourself to. And when you get this was a study done in I think it was in Scandinavia. So it was the only factor was socioeconomic status that really came into play. And when in a high school with people from a low income area and a high income area, same ethnicity, more violence, more discontent, more people feeling deprived because of that comparison group. And I think the relative deprivation has gotten way worse in our culture on social media. Because, you know, it's just in your face all the time. Like, other people seem to be having a better time, a better relationship. You know, it's like their pandemic's going better. They're cuddled up on their couch with their whatever, you know, whereas you're not. I mean, it's just social media just makes it so much worse. Constantly feeling deprived.
As I looked at the questions that you asked, you said you weren't going to ask people to share them, but you know, I'm interested in sharing mine. The question I think was, what do you think about rich people? They either inherited it or they worked to get it. I mean, that's the two ways that I think about how people get money. And most people, I tell people I've been retired most of my life, because being retired, I think, simply means that you do what you want to do. It isn't sitting on the couch and looking at TV for me, and it isn't taking trips for me. I think it's a function of doing what it is you want to do. If you do what you want to do, you're retired. I don't remember the rest of them. Let's see. Oh, the other thing about money, you know, my father and my mother, you talk, what did they teach you? My mother taught me about money by example. My father taught me about money vis-a-vis discussions. We had something called the 3 S's, and they had to be done in the particular order that he taught it. That is, share, save, and spend. Now, by the way, I'm talking about a man who was a sharecropper, who didn't have much money, but he still had this set of principles about money: share, save, and spend. Share 10% of what you have with God, save 10% for times that are hard, and spend the 80%. And I can remember when my family was taking in $25 a week, feeding 5 children. At the time that I can remember, it was feeding 5 children and 2 adults, $25 a week. And my mother would faithfully take $2.50 of that, put it into a mason jar. She'd take another $2.50 of that and put it into another mason jar. And when we went to church, she would give us various parts of that $2.50 that week. And my part was a dime. And of course, I, being a very smart young man, I decided 10% was reasonable for me to give to the church. That meant that I should only give the church a penny of that dime, and I should keep 9 cents of it. Somehow my mother didn't go along, but that sounded like a reasonable way to handle it to me. But that's the way I learned about money.
What a great story. Thank you.
So your mason jar example, it's really, really profound for what's happening right now, because what happens is money is so abstract right now. A lot of people don't even really handle cash. And so how do you teach your children those fundamentals? You know, so the saving, the giving. I have an investing one for my son too, as well as the spending. So my wife and I sat and like, what are the things we want our sons to learn? And so we make it physical. We give them cash and they stick it in various jars. And then so I'm trying to find ways to make it concrete so that I can make sure that we're teaching our values.
By the way, I want to speak against the old Monopoly, the new Monopoly game. The new Monopoly game, I'm told, I really haven't used it, but I'm told the new Monopoly game has gone away from hard cash. They don't have the banker and the money anymore. I think that's a very poor way to run a Monopoly game.
I didn't know that. It makes me think, I didn't have my wallet with me last week, and a friend gave me some cash because we had to gas up the car on the way to going somewhere, and I wanted to pay her back. So I said, PayPal or Venmo? And she said, oh, I've never used Venmo. Send me it through Venmo. I want to try that out. So I did it. I sent her Venmo, and then she didn't know what to do with it. And you have to put it in your bank account, or you have to do something else with it. And so when you just said, Brad, that we're living in a culture that we don't handle money anymore, we're in this virtual board game. But Venmo in particular, because it's a social media platform, you can watch your people that you're linked to, where they're spending their money. I can see my daughter, when she buys something online, it shows up in her Venmo account, and I have access. I can see her Venmo spending. So this is a new phenomena, combining how we exchange money, and we can observe other people and their expenditures. So I saw her friend, for example, bought a massage, and it came up somehow because she was linked to her friend. So I was like, whoa, I didn't know that I could see that online on my phone. Not even online, right? We have these supercomputers wherever we go in our pockets. So it's quite an interesting phenomena that we're culturally experiencing, but us older folks, we're being introduced to it backwards. But kids that are growing up, and that's the only thing they know, wow, what's the world going to be like moving forward? Karen, let's unmute you.
Okay. I love this. This is a great session. Thank you so much. I have an adult child who moved home from the pandemic stuff. I want to know more about that dependent, independent, how much, and I have a daughter who I give money to sometimes. And I'm curious about the happy, if you make a certain amount, you're happy, but beyond that, it doesn't really add a whole lot to your happiness. That was great. And you said these scripts lead to healthy money behavior, like you saving enough for retirement and you don't have a lot of credit card debt. And I paid off my house. I don't have a mortgage. And my father kind of taught me that, like, you shouldn't even have a mortgage. You should have no debt. That was too extreme, but so that's like 3 questions. I don't know. Take your pick.
Yeah. So
find a list of these financial healthy habits somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, I have I developed the financial health scale, and so that's probably a good place to start, because you can kind of look at so I put my email in the chat. If you want to send me an email, I can send you that that financial health questionnaire that we've used in the studies, because it's a good little checklist, I think. Like, what are the categories? But essentially, it's low debt, consumer debt, non-secured debt. You know, like the mortgage is debatable, right? But here's the other thing too. I get a lot of, it comes up on occasion. People are like, should I pay off my mortgage? I have the money to pay off my mortgage. And the answer to that is, I don't know, but I can tell you I've never met anyone who paid off their mortgage who regretted it. And I've met a lot of people who didn't, who'd regret it. So that's the only thing I can say related to that. And, you know, I think the financial enabling, it's really similar to, quote, enabling in any other way. It's like, there is no right or wrong answer. It's just, what's the behavioral pattern of the person receiving the money? That's really the where you make your judgment call on, is this financial help that helps, or is it financial help that hurts? And that's sort of the question you have to be asking yourself along the way. So constantly asking yourself, noticing the behaviors, because it can be, like I said, it can be really disempowering. Like, people talk about it as a character issue. It's not a character issue. It's strictly Skinnerian. Like, you know, human beings want to avoid suffering and seek pleasure. And you can set up anyone on a trial related to money to engage in whatever behavior that you're trying to shift. Like, what I've seen is, I've seen people who have the mindset, I don't need to worry about money because it's not going to matter. Like, whatever I do doesn't matter. And it just makes sense that when a job becomes difficult or a boss becomes a jerk, that you're like, look, I don't want to go to work anymore. Of course I don't want to. And so can't fault them if they have other options. If they don't have other options, they have a tendency to stick with it. And as you know, there's probably some growth involved in that suffering and trying to cope with that. So those are my thoughts on that.
And I think that's great, that if you make enough money to, you know, have your house and all your stuff, but then you make another $10 million, it doesn't really add. I don't know. It's so interesting right now that like this Warren Buffett and Gates, and they're helping people and they're making vaccines and all this stuff. And then we have one person who's an example of being totally greedy and self-centered and really disheartening example.
I used to use Trump as an example of this stereotypical bad rich person, but I stopped using it once he became president, because it wasn't meant as a political statement. Actually, it was just meant as sort of like what the image he puts into the world, you know, is sort of fascinating. And what's really fascinating too is he is the poor person's concept of a rich person. It's fascinating, right? It's like, you know, hey, why is my name, you know, get rich and then you put your name on a building, you know, it's sort of the
nouveau riche stuff is like gross. I think it's like you have a gold toilet or something. I mean, it's what is that? How does that improve your life? I don't know. I don't need to get on my soapbox, but
I will say this too on so the one thing I didn't really talk about is to King's point, I call it a financial comfort zone in our research. So whatever separates you from your tribe creates tremendous amount of anxiety. And so what happens is, if you win the lottery, I tell people, so I do work with people come into, quote, sudden money. And I tell them that they're facing a really, really big dilemma here. I say, you're going to have to either get rid of all your money or get rid of all your friends. And I say that to sort of like shock them a little bit, because it's not 100% true, but it's pretty darn close. Like, you have to have a really, really good relationship with your family and friends if you want to find a way to hold on to some of that money or a large portion of that money, because what it does is all of a sudden you don't belong to the tribe anymore. You're kind of kicked out, and it creates so much psychological distress for people that they end up getting rid of the money and going right back. And there's tons of examples of this. People in sports who come into big contracts, music, and we've worked with a lot of those individuals. And so it's essentially some of that's cultural values too, right? So if you grow up in a poor environment, it's like you share. That's the only way everyone survives, is everybody has to share. And so if all of a sudden you get a bunch more money, there's really strong expectations that you share. And if you're not going to share all of it in that sense, it can create fractures in relationships that are really devastating. So it helps explain why most people, like the vast majority of people who come into fast, big money end up going right back to where they were. And I think it's that psychological pressure to belong to your tribe.
Good.
Brad, welcome to the Helpers Boulder County tribe of clinicians and clergy and mental health professionals. You're now one of us.
I love it.
So, by the way, would you say something more about what you're doing here? Do you have a private practice? Are you consulting? I know you were quoted in the New York Times last Sunday as an expert in an article that I read. Yeah,
so so my wife is from Kauai, And I was in Hawaii for 20 years. And we lived on Kauai for most of it, Oahu, some of it. But my wife grew up on Kauai. And I sort of describe Kauai as a small Midwestern town surrounded by ocean. And so if you grow up there, there's, you know, frankly, a lot of teenagers become suicidal and depressed and want to get the heck out of there. And you can't get the heck out of there. All you can do is drive around, you know, the island, and you can't escape. And so I think she grew up, my wife's a clinical psychologist, by the way, too. And I think that she grew up there, and it's like, she spent a lot of her adolescence going, get me the hell out of here. And so she ended up back there after her graduate training when we met. And now that we have a 7 and a 3-year-old, she's like, I want them to have a more, frankly, diverse experience of the world and other opportunities, et cetera, more stuff to do. So last summer we moved here, and then the pandemic happened. And so now we're just stuck at home, essentially without the beach. But she went to CU. So she liked it here. She had a great time here. And so in terms of where do you go, where do you go after you live in Hawaii? And I'll tell you where you don't go. You don't go back to Detroit, where I'm from, and because you're probably going to get pretty depressed when the winter hits and you don't see the sun for 9 months. And so essentially that's why we moved here. And so I do a few different things. I'm a professor at Creighton, as I mentioned. I also own an asset management company where we manage assets for clients. And then I got my 6th book coming out in November, and I continue to do studies related to trying to improve people's financial behaviors, essentially.
Do you have any interest in running a support group for therapists who are needing to deal with the money issues?
Maybe. If I can be of service.
What's of interest during this pandemic period is most everyone I talk to, my colleagues, we're all, our practices are full up. We're having more clients in need. And the stories are, at least in my practice, are way across the board, from people who are comfortable and looking for what to do after they watched all the Netflix movies, so they're buying puzzles and board games, to people who are on the street with holding up signs. And the money that the government is providing, of course, is inadequate to meet basic needs. So the pandemic crisis that we're in, the world crisis that we're in, I think is highlighting or accentuating money issues across the board. In our bubble of the Republic of Boulder, I think we're shielded from the greater whole of what's going on across the country. But I think all of us who are still working full-time or busy in our practices had the accidental privilege of being able to Zoom and still work with people. And so our whole profession has changed, where we no longer see people in person. Very few people I know who are clinicians. I talked to a clinician this morning who I work with, who sees one client out of her caseload because he can't figure out how to work his computer. So he's come into the office. But outside of that, we're all now sort of getting quite comfy with this remote supportive connections and this fake community. We're all in these Hollywood squares feeling kumbaya. We're all together in this crazy world that we're living in. So I don't know what to say other than we're all in an experiment. We're all in one of your studies right now, and we don't really know what the outcome is or what the results are going to be. I was hoping there was going to lead to a question, but I don't have a question there. King?
You say we're all in the study, and yet we're not in it equally. If you look at what is happening as it relates to COVID-19, there are many people who I know who have to get up every morning and go to work at the grocery store, have to get up every morning and go to work at the gas station. They have to get up every day and do the job that they were doing before COVID-19 ever occurred. So they can't go on Zoom and serve you your meal. And those who are working in restaurants are having a particularly difficult time now. Fortunately, it is beginning to come back, but it is a long ways from being back. One of my children owns a restaurant, and they can only have 25% of the tables available to them. So the stress, the money stress that they feel is very different than the money stress that the people who can do their job on Zoom or no longer have to do a job.
Excellent point. Yeah.
The metaphor I heard is, you know, we're all in this huge storm, but we're all in a very different boat, having a very different experience with it.
That's a good way to look at it.
Jed, did you have a comment? I thought I saw your hand go up.
So, so one of the perspectives that I've come to, and I probably was brought up in this perspective, is that basically money is a tool and it has no intrinsic value per se. A dollar bill, you can't do anything with a dollar bill except maybe build a fire with it. But it's a tool that you can use skillfully or unskillfully. And there are hand tools like screwdrivers and pliers and paper money. And there are power tools like investments and stock markets and tools that sort of operate on an outside power source, which is kind of curious. And I wonder if that perspective is a reasonable way to pass that on to your kids, that it's something that you can use and you can do a good job or a bad job with it. And let's talk over how you're managing that. So
yeah, I love that metaphor, and I use that quite often because it has that non-attachment, non-judgment related to it, and it's like a hammer, and you can use it to build a beautiful house, or you can use it to tear a house down, and people do either things with it. It's also a personality accentuator, I've noticed, you know, like, and I think we talked about, Karen, you brought up the money and happiness thing. And I've noticed this interesting existential depression that comes when people have lived a life of fantasy about whatever it is, right? But money is one of those fantasies that once I get X amount of money, then I'll be happy. And I've seen people who have ruined every relationship they've ever had for 2 decades to get to that money spot. And then it's almost like the Wizard of Oz, where they look behind the curtain and like there is no wizard. And it's like looking back on what you just did to get there and realizing that there is no there and that you're not all of a sudden happy. And what I've noticed is there's a really interesting study done years ago. They looked at lottery winners and they looked at accident victims. And what they found, and accident victims who, you know, had an injury and some of them a permanent injury, what they found is the lottery winners were obviously happier in the first 6 months or so, but after that, the accident victims were happier. And I think part of that was, you know, the fantasy's dead. And it's almost like there's almost like some psychological value in believing that, well, once you get there, then you'll be happy. It's like this interesting hedonic, and you've heard of the hedonic treadmill. It's almost like there's something that's a value for that, for us as a species, because I think you don't have to face the existential questions. I don't know.
Ricardo, did you have your hand up? We got to unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, you're on.
Brad, I know we're coming to the end here, but you know, one of the things that I think might be interesting for folks to hear about is a new adventure that you're moving into with TikTok. And I think that this is a very interesting thing from our traditional psychology training, where, first of all, we haven't had the opportunity to be in media as much as certainly Brad has, and he's taken that opportunity. But it's a whole world that I think could open up a lot for other generations, because that's the way they get messaging. And if you're interested in really seeing what that looks like, Brad, maybe you can share just a little bit about what you're doing there, because I think it's totally out of the box for what we see in clinical psychology. It's like, this is way beyond than giving an interview, you know, or being an expert. This is really matching the message to the medium.
Hey, Brad, can you share one of your videos and share a screen and show us one?
I don't know if I can do that.
Because Trump is about to eliminate TikTok.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to do that. I don't know if the audio, but I'll share.
Is there a way to link to TikTok, to your videos on TikTok, or you search within TikTok?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Here, I'll just show you what my profile looks like. I'm Dr. Brad Klontz on TikTok.
Okay.
If you have the courage to download the app, be careful. But yeah, so my practice on Kauai. So I was drawing this down. So before I moved to Boulder, though, I was still 2.5 days a week. I was the clinical director of the school-based behavioral health program on the island of Kauai. And so I was doing that for 20 years, and I had an office in a high school. So I've worked with high school kids for 20 years, doing mental health services and everything. And so and most of them were low income. And so I love those guys, especially the ODD ones. I just love them. And so essentially I'm very much, a big part of my life has been trying to help those people thrive, that demographic, and become more effective in their life, et cetera. So they're all on TikTok. And so my nephew showed me TikTok, and they're 14. And I started to look on there, and there's just horrendous financial advice. I mean, like terribly destructive financial advice being spewed. And so I got so mad that I started to make videos on TikTok. And so I probably post 4 a day, and I go after the psychology of wealth. I go after the success mindset, locus of control. And what's crazy, and Ricardo, thanks for bringing it up, I've kind of gone viral there. So I have almost 200,000 followers, which is just a crazy number of people. And like I did a video last week, had 4.1 million views, which is a significant part of the population, essentially, right? And so the pandemic for me, I've sort of stumbled on that medium, which fits my personality great, because I'm a bit of a ham and I don't take myself too seriously. It goes right after that young demographic that I'm trying to inspire. And so anyway, it's just been a lot of fun, frankly. I don't really have a business model around it. But it's just
You're not buying your books yet, huh?
Yeah. A lot of them can't afford to buy the book. So I just love putting out that information into the world. And when I'm doing it, I'm picturing a low income kid like me growing up who wants to make their life better, doesn't know first of all, doesn't even know if they can better their life, doesn't know anyone, doesn't have a mentor who's successful in business, whatever. And so I'm designing my content to speak to that person.
Fantastic. Well, maybe this is a good time to close. I see the clock running out. I so want to thank you, Brad, and appreciate your giving us which would normally have been a very, very expensive consultation if we had hired you for this talk. So I appreciate you joining us and being part of our community. And I welcome you to continue to participate with us. Thanks, Ricardo, for bringing Brad on and for introducing him. And just another little plug for King Harris, who's joined us today, who's our next speaker. So I hope you all come back and spread the word. I'm excited to dialogue with King next month rather, and continue the discussion on a different topic. So
thank you.
That,
yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it was my honor. I'm super excited to be connected with you all now. And more than anything, I just hope that I did not embarrass Ricardo and that I made him proud. That was my #1 goal since he vouched for me today. So, okay.
Well, I don't know how Ricardo feels, but I think you did well, Brad. This is King Harris.
Thank you, King.
I happen to do some of the same kind of work around working with children, young people, and wealth building.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next month, hopefully.
Yeah.
Be well. Be safe.
Bye, everybody.
Blessings. Be safe, everyone.
Bye-bye.